welcome to The Way of the Spiritual Path. My name is Ursula Lentini. This episode we're going to explore the deeper layers of addiction. We think we know what addiction is until we start diving in. It is so multi-layered, and that's why I believe it needs a multi-layered approach to finding a cure for it. In the subconscious work that I've done with so many people, I see addiction being played out over and over and over again. Most clients don't even have a clue that they're running addiction. So we think, okay, addiction, drugs, alcohol, cigarettes. That's the main frame of our reference. No. Cell phone use, food. Oh, the food is the worst one because the drugs, alcohol, and cigarettes, if you cut them out of your life, okay, life just goes on. But with food, you have to eat food. So it's always a guessing game of why am I eating and who in me is looking for the food. So let's see if we can break down some of the layers of addiction that we're dealing with at any given moment. I also have done 2 shows with Vanessa Kreitz, who is pretty much an expert, in my opinion, about addiction. She's very familiar with the 12-step program and has a lot of education and information around addiction, the chemistry of it, etc. I invite you to watch those 2 shows as well. What I've noticed about people struggling from addiction is there's a few things on my list that there's check boxes for. One of them is that they're a highly sensitive person. So they're more sensitive than the average person. Their skin is a little thinner, so to speak. They have more of a reaction to life than most people do. They tend to be empathic, where they feel other people's feelings. So again, the world's a little rougher than somebody who's not empathic. They come from a family that has addiction in them because it's a really inherited chemical makeup that hands down from generation to generation. So I've read that there's like a cellular structure. So when that gets turned on, then you can't really turn it off. Like that programming almost. It's also nurtured, right? So it's behavior. Many of the people who live in a culture where drug and alcohol or addictive behavior is normal. It's the standard. Everybody's doing it. So of course that's what they do. And that sometimes comes up in a socioeconomical environment, especially when we're teenagers and everybody's exploring, a bad behavior, rebellious behavior. They want to do something kind of bad and sneaky. The easiest thing to do is drugs and alcohol because it's right there, cigarettes. And then if you have an addiction propensity and your family has addiction running through its blood, now you gotta get hooked a little bit. The other thing I noticed that's a common denominator in people running addiction is they're artistic. So not everybody's a painter, of course. It could be through music. It could be through poetry. It could be through words. It could be expressed through cooking or decorating their home or their notebooks or just any kind of way. So an artist is not necessarily always identifiable. They may have just a love to listen to music, but it's actually that artistic aspect within them that's having that draw. It could be somebody who loves to do physical things, and that's how they express themselves in a creative way. When an artist, let me just break down the artist piece. Artists, their framework, their modeling, their wiring is that they have highs and lows. So this is how I explain it. There's a zero line, and then everything plus and then negative. Not meaning good or bad, but just a higher vibration and a lower vibration. So there's the zero line. An artist, it's almost like they're suffocating on the zero line. They can't be the cow in the herd. They need to be the sheep, the black sheep running off into the woods exploring something new. So they go for an elevated reality. If you think of the famous artists and you read their lifestyles, they would disappear into their art for days at a time. So for me, they go on a very high level of frequency, and they're with God. They're in the zone. They're in their creative resource, and they're making their art. They're expressing the truth within them. And it's a beautiful thing. It's just magical, and all that an artist wants to do is live in there all the time. But of course, that can't be. It's too extreme. So they create the art, they back up, and they're like, I don't know, is this even good? That's the sign of a good artist. They're not sure about their art. They're like, I don't know, other people like it. I guess it's okay. None of them really are just like, oh, I'm fabulous. Oh, it's perfect. It's that. They don't really have that. A true artist is just like, that just came through, and that's just how it turned out. And do you like it? So after they come down from that high, of course, everything seeks balance. The tendency is to go straight down past the zero line into the darkness. So drugs, alcohol, oversexing, all of that stuff is very easy to do because it's just the extreme opposite. Except down there's a hole in the bottom, and it can keep sinking and sinking and sinking and sinking. People get suicidal down there. They go into deep, dark depression, and so on and so forth. When I work with artists, I explain that that's what's happening because they don't know, because artists tend to live in the moment. Their input and observation is so rich that they don't really track time and things like that. That they'll sleep a lot, or they'll just kind of disappear. They'll just check out, they'll numb out, they'll watch lots of TV. So they don't really understand, like, oh yeah, last week when I was creating, I was in a high, and this week I'm in a low. It's something new for them. So if you point that out, that they have highs and lows, then they'll start tracking them and start understanding them. The best way for an artist to deal with going up and down is to have a buffer in the zero zone. So a community, a family, habits, a morning routine, spiritual practice, a sport, whatever. So when they go high, they can come down and they can kind of bounce on the trampoline or be caught by the high wire net and kind of hang out there with support so they don't have to slip down into the darkness. So they'll hang out here, get fed, do what they need to do, and then creep back up and do some more art. That's plausible. When the addict is also the artist, which is really frequently, they have these highs and lows. So they use. Because when they're high, they're like, this is awesome. And they think, if I use drugs, or if I use alcohol, or if I use sex, or if I use extreme behavior, I'll stay up there. And I'll be, really making great, fantastic art. For me, the art is coming through them through spirit, and the drugs and alcohol either help them get there or stay there or whatever in their mind. But they don't really have to do that. Drugs and alcohol are another way to buffer us from our ego. So people are like, yeah, I do that so I can just get out of my head. And you're like, oh, okay. There's so many excuses to use something. So the artist will tend to use drugs and alcohol either up here or way down here. So it's almost like they're trying to counteract the highs and lows by inducing different highs and lows, or saying, when I get depressed, I have to use drugs to keep me out of the dark hole. Well, that's one take. You could do that, and if it works, fine, but not fine. So if we can remove that propensity to use to balance that out, that will be a healthier version, but they have to create a community to bounce off on. Okay, so that's the art of the artistic expression of the addict. The other thing is that the world is an aggressive place, and they need a buffer. They can't take it anymore. They don't have any tools, no coping strategies. They just need a buffer. Need something to numb them out enough so the world is not such an aggressive place. Understandable, of course. Along with that, the other idea is that there's an emptiness inside. They could be having a healthy family and things are going well and everything's good. No sicknesses, no moving around, the mom and dad's getting along fine. Perhaps they've been raised in neglect, which is worse than abuse. Because abuse, you can say, hey, this is what's going on. Look, listen. feel. This is not okay. But neglect, you have the roof over your head, you have the mom and dad, everybody's polite, there's no drama, there's no fighting, you have food, you have school, like what's your problem? But they're not getting the nurturing. They're not getting the emotional interactions that we all need as human beings. They're not getting the touch. They're not engaged in experiences and realities and relationships. So the neglected child will always have a question mark, like, what's wrong with me? Everybody else is running around having fun or crying or doing this, that, and the other thing, but I'm just like this blank person. And that's because of the neglect. And it's not obvious. And to me, it's like it's almost like a secret abuse. Because the child is like, they don't want to ask for anything because everything is really provided for, so who are they to beg for more? And people who neglect their children, they don't know any different, because guess what? They were neglected as well, because we just keep rolling down the family avenue because that's what we've been taught and that's the way we do things. So sometimes that child who's been from a neglected family, they just have this emptiness inside their heart, inside their world, and they're like, what's the purpose? What's the point? Who am I? Why am I here? So it doesn't always have to be neglect. That could be a series of questions from any kind of lifestyle, but that's an obvious thing to them. So, of course, if we have this big, gaping, empty hole, we want to fill it. And, of course, the more you use, the less filled it gets somehow or other. Drugs, alcohol, cigarettes, and basically any distraction or avoidance. Food, cell phone use, workaholic. Oh, yes, we've accepted that into our languaging. But it's distraction. When we get into super codependent relationships, where one person is the drama queen, male or female, doesn't matter, and the other person is the support system or the reactor. Just like when they do two comedians and they work off of each other, it's the same deal. So without that person who is holding all the power within the family or within the work community or situation, so the person who's holding all the power is the person who's like controlling everything, and that's the addict. In the family dynamics, if you came home from school or you were out doing something and you came home as a kid and you had to neutralize yourself, don't be upset, don't be happy, don't be everything until you check in with your parents to see what kind of mood they're in, and then you can be like, oh, mom's in a bad mood, okay, don't be happy, because that mood will become splashing all over me. Or I'm upset about this thing, but dad's upset about that thing, so my upset should not outshine his upset, God forbid, because then I'll get clobbered again. So we have to always adjust to other people's personality. That's another addict behavior within a family structure, even within a work structure. The layers of all of that is to say that they're really the people who are using, if you could just take away all the hurt in their life and then take away all the reason to use in their life, you would find the most beautiful people, the most precious, sweetest, kindest, loving, gentle people. And of course the world's too rough for those kind of folks. Of course they get misbehaved, of course people misbehave and crush them. One of my little things that I look at when I'm assessing things is, if you gave a little boy, a healthy little boy, normal, whatever, 8 years old, and you gave him one of those collector dolls with the pretty dress and the apron and the frills and the lace and the hair and the eyelashes, and so pretty that the girls know they don't even want to mess with it, they just put it on the shelf and they look how adorable it is all the time and they just love it. But if you give a boy and say, this is your doll, you can do anything you want with it, you close the door, like you have a camera in there watching, the kid's going to be like, oh, this is nice. And so, like, within probably 10-15 minutes, all the clothes are ripped off and that doll is being smashed against the wall and like that. They're not going to respect that. It's our animal nature to crush things that are beautiful. When we're walking along the road and there's some wild flowers, we pull them because we want them. We want to own them. We want to look at them. We want to have control over them. But by the time you get home, they're dead. So really, to honor beauty is to leave it alone and appreciate it and to love upon it from as it is. But our human animal nature, we like to destroy beautiful things. Don't ask me why. That's what happens to these precious people who turn into addicts, is because the world's too rough for them. Too much input, no coping tools. So when you see a mother patiently nurturing her child and she's like, use your words, what's going on inside, what do you feel? It's that sensitive child who can say, I'm overwhelmed right now, I'm freaking out, that person's being mean to me, that person over there is bothering me, because they're empathic. And if that person over there who's bothering them is holding a bunch of anger, and that child is just this little innocent child, but they're sharing the same space with this angry adult, it's too overwhelming, and they don't even know. They're not tracking. They're like, oh, that guy's so angry and he's really upsetting me. They're just like, I feel weird, I don't know what's happening. And the mom's got to be a detective to figure out what's going on with the sensitive child. Or they ate some sugar and now they're bouncing off the walls and the mom's trying to control them. So she's like, doctor, my kid's out of control. And the doctor's like, oh, here's some lithium, here, take this. And then the child's on numb. So the child's like, oh, this numb thing really works because I don't have to deal with everything. I don't have to feel everything. Well, now we've just created another addict in the world. It's a big mess. There's a chemical component, there's an emotional component, there's a historical component, there's a sensitivity component, there's an artistic component, there's a cultural component. So how does a person dig themselves out of all of these layers to find that beautiful, precious self? And when they find that beautiful, precious self, how are they going to deal with all the dark things in their world that they needed the buffer to protect themselves from? So at some point you're just like, oh, forget it. Forget it. As long as I can stay out of jail and keep some primary relationships, like, I'm good. I don't want to do all the work, because it's a ton of work. Because not only are the people doing it for themselves, they're doing it for their ancestors, because those traits have been handed down. Those sensitivities been handed down. And the tendencies to use have been handed down. So it's a ton of work to dig out from all of those layers. And they're also doing the work for the future. And they're doing the work because we're all really interconnected. So when we do any of our personal deep work for ourselves, for our own life, we're actually rippling out, doing the work for everybody. So that's the deal. That's the layers. I have found in the internal family systems work that I provide that people can start sorting those things out and start learning and reconnecting with those precious parts of themselves. And then learning tools on when that can be shared or when we need to protect. And then instead of using, we can have these protector parts come out and be like, hey, I'll deal with you, darkness. I'll deal with you, aggressive world. And the gentle, sweet parts can stay in the back and not have to deal with those things, not feel so hurt by everything. And then our selves, our different layers of our true self and our protective self and our warrior self, or our speaking their truth self, can come in and protect those gentle parts of ourselves. Then we, within our own environment, our own experience, can have a super rich life. Because we can see things from that sweet, innocent place and explore the world in a fascinating way. Create art and expressions that are absolutely stunning. That's the balance that can be achieved. I was speaking with somebody, a colleague, and she's like, it's the perfect storm. To have that sweetness, to have the layers of addiction and all the junk that comes with it, and then to be able to do all of the healing and retrieve and find out the best part of you that's been there all the time. So I hope this helps sort some things out for you. I would like to hear your comments. Thank you for joining me on the way of the spiritual path. This episode is called Me and My Ego. Are you familiar with that old-time song, Me and My Shadow? Well, we were just listening to it, and Frank Sinatra's version. It's about the inseparability of ego and self, and it's always there. If you think about shadows, they come out only during the light. So when light is shining on a subject, its shadow is very obvious. When we're enlightened or we're on our spiritual path of enlightenment, the dark stuff really shows up. Clearly, it's definable. When we're hanging out in the gray area of the world, in our grayness within ourselves, or we're in a gray vibration, meaning, we're kind of drinking too much, sleeping too much, watching too much TV, just going to work and living a boring life, we're in the gray zone. And then sometimes we slip into the dark area. We're dealing with depression or we're in unhealthy relationships. The darkness will keep us very hidden from our own darkness. So we'll put a dark environment, then of course you can't see a shadow. Gray environment, of course you can't see a shadow. But when we start moving into the light, now the shadows are obvious. For this talk, the shadow is the ego. And the ego's not necessarily bad. Because on the spiritual path, nothing's bad. Everything just is. It's neither good nor bad. Thinking it makes it so. Neither good nor bad, it just is. So when we can start looking at any darkness within us and saying, well, I think that it's bad. I think it's wrong. I really judge it. But if I look at it a different way, if I kind of put on a different set of sunglasses to look at it, a different colored lens to look at that ego or that darkness or that bad habit or just something we get irritated about within our own self. If we can rename it or reframe it, we can connect with it. Because every time we reject something, then we're not connected to it. On the spiritual path, the source, the foundation, the bottom line of every suffering that we experience, it's been said, and I agree with it, that it's a sense of separation from the divine. When we trust the divine, when we know spirit, when we have a connection, when we have our clairaudience or our clairvoyancy, when we're surrounded with like-minded people who are supporting us on our spiritual path, then we don't really suffer that much. So if we're connected, we don't feel separated, and no matter what happens, it's going to be okay. Because it always ends up okay one way or the other. But when we think that there's separation, that's where we feel anxious. When we have the terrible twos, I believe that the terrible twos is becoming aware that the mobile or the adult or the food or the toy is not a part of us the way it was when we were first born. So when things start moving aside and we're crying our head off and no one's coming to tend to us, we realize I'm not in charge of my entire environment, that there is other. So when there's other, that means there's separation. When we start understanding that there's separation, we get the idea that there's separation, then we go into anxiety. Like, oh my God, I'm not being supported. So then, from age 2 to whenever we land on the path, whatever crisis puts our butt square in the path of the straight and difficult, the straight and hard. I just call it the straight and narrow because hard, again, is a label that we're putting on something. So when we land on the path and we're like, oh, wait, what's going on here? After many years of work or deep soul searching, we realize the sense of separation has been broken and we want to connect again with that which created us. Thus, the identification of the ego when I was doing the internal family systems as a receiver, as a client, and let me explain what that is in case you don't know. Internal family systems is where we go inside and we talk to different parts of us. We discover who and what we are, where we come from, which events have shaped us, which ideas about ourselves or the world around us is framing our outlook on life, how we experience life, is basically how we perceive it, right? So an angry man lives in an angry world. A peaceful man lives in a peaceful world. They live in the same world, but their perception, based on their experience, is how they're filtering their reality. So the internal family systems is discovering all the parts of us. An angry part, an anxious part, a worry part, like that. So we think all those thoughts that running through our head, all that talking going on in our head all the time is us thinking these thoughts. But if you move into the reality of the internal family system, there's you, your true self, who's primarily the observer, your Christ-like consciousness, your Buddha self, your best self, your soul. There's no wants or needs on that part of you, and that's our truest part. But then any other part that comes up is pretty much ego-based, with the sense of separation, fear, anxiety, etc. And then we can talk to those parts. In our mind, when we're not conscious of this first, we think it's all of us, just talking. But when we start looking at the parts, we can say, oh, look, the worry part has the mic in my mind again. So the worry part will go on and on and on. And then if you can calm it down, it'll go away. And then another part, maybe we have list makers or a critical part or something like that. So they trade out. They just trade out, just like you're watching a stand-up, when the next guy comes up and the next guy. Most of it is not funny because it's really attacking you, or it's hard on you, or it's making you feel bad about yourself. The foundation of ego is fear-based. Many people agree to that. But if you keep digging further, it can be the sense of separation, because we're afraid when we're separated from that which is feeding us. So when a child feels lost in the shopping mall, that child freaks out because it doesn't have the connection it needs. It doesn't have the security or the resource that it needs. So just like a child having a parent, when we have our resource of our spiritual understanding, or the connection of whatever is beating our heart and breathing our lungs, is basically what I say. So if we don't have that connection, of course we're going to get anxious and fearful. So we're afraid of the separation. We're afraid of the aloneness. We're afraid of not being supported. We're afraid of being unresourced. All right, so and that ego, boy, there's like 300 parts at least that can be expressed in that fear of being separated. So I provide internal family systems to my clients. I love doing the work. It really heals so many layers and so many different aspects of ourselves. I'm fascinated each and every time. I've done this for years now, and I've done thousands of sessions, and I just can't get enough. It's really fascinating, and the most thing is it's beautiful. It's beautiful to see a person transform, to realize, to get to know parts of themselves, and to make that connection so they don't feel separated. When we have a trauma or a drama or a crisis, what's happening is there's a flood of information coming on to us and too many emotions at the same time. We can't process it. So that space and time gets locked, and then we just shove it away, but we refer from it. When we do the healing, we kind of bring that forward, we unlayer the emotions and bring that peace back into our hearts. So that's the connection. When I was doing my work as a client on the receiving end, I was meeting a little part, and this part was under the carpet. Like there was a lump under the carpet in my mind that, you go through visuals. And I was telling my therapist, there's a lump under the carpet. And he's like, oh, well, let's ask the lump to come on out. But it wouldn't come out. So we were just kind of curious about it. And he suggested, we just said hi to the lump, and I see you're there and I accept you. And if you want to just stay there, that's fine. So then the next session we kind of checked in on the lump, and it wasn't under the carpet this time, it was under a blanket. So we're like, oh, it's under a blanket. And again, it wouldn't say anything to us. It was just there hanging out. And so we accepted it and felt like, okay, if you want to talk, we're here. And if you don't, that's fine. You're welcome to stay. Which is a good way to be to parts that we don't know, parts of ourselves we don't know, or people even that we're trying to get used to, and they're just testing us like, do you accept me? I do a lot of work in schools and with children, and sometimes a child will act out to test the adult. Do you still love me if I'm acting out? Or will you reject me? And parts of us also do that. So it'll be ugly. It'll be an ugly part or a difficult part to be with, or an irritating part or a whiny part, or you're just like, oh, please shut up. But that part might be testing us to say, do you accept me and love me even if I'm not the good girl, or I don't behave, or I'm not the pleaser, or I'm not perfect? And for us in the internal world is to say, yeah, I accept you. That's the most loving thing we can do to these parts. People who are acting out are struggling. If they were fine, they wouldn't be acting out. So something's up with them. And they're looking for attention and they just don't know how to get it. So they act up and then we smash them down and, it just gets worse from there. So whenever somebody or a part of us is acting up, it's for us to say, oh, I'm noticing you now. You wanted attention and here it is. What's up with you? Sometimes these parts will retreat and say, nothing, I don't really want you to look at me, and then they kind of disappear. Or they'll say, well, I feel a little insecure and I don't want to share this because I'm embarrassed. Then you provide more love and space and you're like, that's okay. I'm here with you every step of the way. And then eventually they'll share their story. So that's what we were doing to this lump under the blanket. And then we checked in a few more sessions later, and it had transformed into a shiny M&M. I'm like, why is this thing an M&M? And he's like, I don't know, it's just an M&M. So we're like, hey, why do you look like an M&M? Because it was trying to be like, hi, I'm shiny, I'm yummy, I've got texture. And it wanted me to like it. So that made me suspicious right away, because then my suspicious part comes in and is like, really? M&M? Really? Shiny? We're not falling for any of that. So I had to take my suspicious part and say, shh, they're trying. Remember, this was the lump. Like, this is progression. So many sessions, slowly, we get to know this particular part. And by the end of its development in our conversations, it was this tar-covered skeleton, tiny part, like 2 feet tall instead of like a whole-size human being, with a trench coat on, sunglasses, and a hat. And I'm like, what are you? And finally, slowly, it revealed itself to be ego. I'm like, oh, no wonder. So that's the visual on it. But the storyline between me and my ego has been over the course of many, many, many years. First, we think that we are that ego, because the ego likes to, almost like a jellyfish, how it just sticks all over your face and you're just like, oh, this jellyfish is a part of me. So it's almost like a mask that really glues itself on. And we try to be perfect, we try to be the pleaser, we try to impress others, we try to get it right, all of that stuff. So that's not our true nature. Our true nature, we just are, and mistakes are okay. Perfectionism might come in too, because if we're worried about being separated, rejected, if we're being raised in households that say, mommy doesn't like it when you do so-and-so, or good girl, and you get that pat on the head, so you want the pat on the head just like the dog. So you arrange your emotions, your reality, your conditioning to please your parents, because that's the way they want it. So they try to program you that, not realizing that they're not raising authentic children. They're raising little robots. So those of us in the American culture who are being raised as robots, by the time we get teenage land, We start waking up and saying, I'm out with this stuff. I'm not wearing these itchy clothes. I'm not getting those good grades. I'm not stressing myself out about this. I'm not eating that food. And we do all this rebellion. And the parents are like, oh my, who are these little monsters in the house all of a sudden? It's because they're trying to bring into their authenticity. So parenting is a very difficult job, super difficult, probably the hardest job in all the whole world. Even harder than President of the United States, I think. Because parenting, you're aware of your mistakes every day. Because you see them, you say them, you see the result, and then, you pay the consequences, or they pay the consequences. I've never met a mother who said, I'm doing a terrific job. No, never once. So when we start becoming self-aware and saying, why do I behave this way? Why do I react when this thing happens and I react negatively? Why am I so hard on myself? Why am I so critical? Why do I try to strive? Why do I knock myself out to achieve? Why do I feel so hateful towards these group of people or towards this aspect of myself? So when we start asking those questions and answering those questions, we start separating from the ego. Which is pretty funny because the ego's afraid to be separated from the spirit. But when we're on our spiritual path, we need to separate from the ego and start identifying its behavior. So when I started separating from the ego and identifying its behavior, I was like, dang, this thing's obnoxious. How can this thing just be running my life rampant every step of the way, every moment, every decision I make is ego-based, ego-based, ego-based. I was so sick of it when I finally discovered how much it is in my life. So I'm like, all right, ego, you and me, we're on. And I fought with it, and I would ignore it, I would avoid it. And the more attention I gave to the ego, the bigger it got. It's almost like pouring gasoline on a fire and trying to put the fire out. So that didn't work. And then I would just ignore it, and then that would make it more upset. So if you've ever been married or had a sibling who's just obnoxious, it's kind of that scenario. I didn't want to even love the ego. I didn't want to befriend the ego. I wanted to kill the ego. So in the realm of the inner work that we do, it takes so much meditation, so much stillness, so much quietness to get the ego to calm down. Just like if you have a dog, dogs tend to be, excitable. But if you're sitting relaxing, then the dog will sit and relax. Like, oh, this is nice. But as soon as you get up, there's the dog jumping around underfoot, all of that. Same with the ego. So when we do meditation, we can ask the ego to focus on the breath. Ask the ego to pay attention to what's going on. Like, just track all the stuff going on in the room, and the sun, and the lighting, and the candle, or whatever's going on. And the ego can be like tracking. So we want to eventually get to a place where the spirit is leading, at least 51%, and the ego is following. Because the dance of separation and connection is, instead of separating from our ego, we want to try to understand the ego, track the ego, heal the ego, comfort the ego. And believe me, it's a full-time job. Once the ego trusts the spirit within us, our best self, once we've become more consistent and shown the ego, I'm here for you, I love you, I accept you, even though you're just a pain in the backside, it's just a cooperation and a collaboration, just like an obnoxious person that you have to work with, that you have to live with. You just want to find a peaceful way to communicate with them. So once the ego becomes trustful of the spirit self, it will enjoy life a lot more. So the ego can just follow along, it can be obedient. And when we say, okay, ego, we're going to go do something scary, we're going to do something new, you need to zip it. Don't even show up. You stay home, and I'm going to go do this thing. And the ego will be like, but you need me, but you need... No, we don't need you. You can stay. Or you go sit over in the corner. Once it trusts us and becomes obedient with us, it can support us. And we can give it different jobs to do. Mind you, it takes quite a bit of work, but it's worth the effort, because otherwise the ego is driving us. We want to be able to get it obedient, like a good dog, or keeping your office in order, or having a schedule so you can get all the things done that you want to get done. There's some structure that needs to be in place, but really with the ego, it's about understanding that it's separate, it's scared, it's worried, it's obnoxious, it's trying to get our attention. We just need to love on it, accept it for its flaws, because it's very flawed, and understand that we're actually spirit. In my language, I call it child of God. I believe that we're all little cells in the body of the divine, and we all work together, we're all connected. But when we reconnect with our ego, it can calm down, we can support it, it can work for us, and life's a lot better. So those are my thoughts and opinions around my relationship with the ego. I'd like to hear your comments, so please share with me. Thank you for joining on the Lighter Side Network. This is the way of the spiritual path. Thank you.